Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. We are live at the Palais in Geneva, and we are also in Makanda, South Africa, in Rio de Janeiro, and in Copenhagen. And I'm Ben Phillips. I am the host for today, and I'm really honored to be emceeing this event with such an eminent panel. This is the book, and it's an important book because it really takes forward the conversation about inequality by looking at what are the drivers of inequality, by looking at issues of power. And it's produced by two brilliant writers, Maggie and Katja, and by a host of other authors, three of whom we will be hearing from today. We are hosted for today by UNRISD. UNRISD is an autonomous research institution within the UN, and it undertakes interdisciplinary research and policy analysis on the social dimensions of contemporary development issues. And what UNRISD has become famous for is really for pushing debates forward, is for saying what at the time is often challenging and radical, but later becomes the mainstream. And I think that Katja and Maggie have done it again with this fantastic book. You can, because you're here at this launch, you're able to get a discount on the book for 20%. If you look online, if you go on hashtag between fault lines, you'll be able to find the link so that in your region, you'll be able to get this book at discount. Please do. We're really keen to hear people's questions, and the way to ask questions is to use the Q&A function. So on the Zoom Live, you'll see that there's a chat box, and you can fill the chat box with anything you like, your thoughts, your passing comments. But if you have a question, please use the Q&A box. We also really encourage people to tweet about this event. That can be a question, or it can just be sharing your thoughts or the excitement of being at this event. Hashtag between fault lines, and we'll retweet the best ones. Really, really pleased to welcome you, Katja and Maggie, and congratulations on this book. It's explosive. You've made clear in this book that inequality is not an unhappy accident. So a number of other writers have written about, inequality almost as if it's a mistake, as if it's a tragedy. And what you've said is that it's not broken, it was designed this way. And what your book shows is that the many have not been left behind, they've been pushed behind. Can you share with us an outline of the core case that Between Fault Lines make? And can you share some of the examples of the shocking evidence that you've uncovered?
Thank you very much, Ben, and welcome everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here today with Ben, with Maggie, and also with three of this excellent group of authors that have contributed to the book. Yes, I think, Ben, you have already summarized quite nicely, what some of the core themes of the book are. But let me maybe tell you a little bit about the background, about what motivated us to get into this subject, to bring it to the UN, basically. And this book goes back to a project we launched in 2018, and where we started to interrogate, mainstream development discourses and how they deal with inequality. And what we saw that is when actually, despite the fact, that we have actually a sustainable development goal that is focused on reducing inequalities within and between countries, but mostly when development actors speak about inequality, they refer to the bottom of the pyramid. They focus on the poor, they're focused on the lowest 40% of the income distribution, but paid very little attention to the drivers of inequality and the structures that reproduce inequality and reinforce it. So, in answering the question, actually, what drives inequality and what is the role of those at the top, we launched a Call for Papers conference in 2018 that explored these links between inequality and power, which is actually another blind spot, in a lot of development debates. And this blind spot, not talking really, frankly about power asymmetries and what that means for development, often leads to very apolitical and technocratic solutions and policy recommendations. The role of the powerful and the rich is often, not addressed. It remains unexplored, and we wanted to change that. So this project was meant to flip the narrative to a certain extent and to focus also on those at the top of the pyramid, the 1% of the richest, the 0.1% of income earners and wealth owners, powerful multinational companies, the economic models they promote, and the policy influence they have. And we think that this is very important because the concentration of wealth and income is actually an increasing threat for the people who inhabit this planet and for the planet itself. And interestingly, when we go back in history, we see that it has not always been like that. And Ben has actually also published a very exciting book, that shows us a lot of these historical examples. Actually, not so long ago, societies were more egalitarian than they are now. And governments had, in a way, the aim to bring in capital and labor and what, we call a social contract where everyone, would benefit. Of course, this golden age of capitalism, was not that golden for everyone. There were people left behind and left out, women, rural populations, racialized groups. But even when we look at the global South, at newly independent states, we see that they invested a lot in nation building and public services, in redistribution and in inclusion. However, this period was abruptly ended in the early 1980s, and in what we call the neoliberal turn. And we all know the devastating effects that had not only on developing countries in the global South, but also, on working classes in Western societies. More recently, things have even become worse. And I just want to give you a couple of, data points on this. So in the past 3 decades, the top 1% of humanity has captured nearly 20 times the amount of wealth at the bottom 50%. And during COVID, the wealth of the 10 richest men in the world doubled, while more than 120 million people fell or were pushed into poverty. And data released just a week ago show that the number of ultra-high net worth individuals increased by 50% in the last 2 years. So I think these data speak for themselves.
And going off of Katja's point about shifting the development discourse, which is focusing on the bottom of the pyramid, part of that process is really about pointing to the actors responsible for producing and reproducing inequality. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it aspires to leave no one behind, as Ben, you mentioned in your question, but we aren't talking about agentless passive processes that we can attribute to system failure, for example. We're talking about active exclusion with processes and actors that we can identify who take an active role in creating these vulnerabilities, these exclusions, and these inequalities. And what this book tries to do is make those actors visible and the ways that they produce and reproduce inequality. So here is really a small group of people who have a highly disproportionate control over and access to resources. Those resources are then able to translate into influence, which are used to rewrite the rules of the game to their own benefit. So elites accumulate influence and power to preserve and perpetuate a system that is working for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. And it's important to note that the same power asymmetries that drive inequality tend to inhibit policy and institutional change that we need to address those inequalities. So the policies that make the rich richer, they also harm our planet and trigger crisis and compromise our future. So the result is this compounding cycle in which the poor or already disadvantaged groups become further marginalized and suffer the worst consequences of crisis, where the rich gain more power while using wealth to largely insulate themselves from the effects of poverty, inequality, environmental degradation, disruption, violence, and insecurity. So in order to break through this adverse cycle of compounding inequalities. We need a better understanding of what drives inequalities in different contexts, what economic spaces and political strategies can help to overcome them. So to do this book, to participate in this conversation, zooms in on the sites of fracture that have been made by inequality, where we see most clearly the impact that it has on individual lives and who stands to lose and who stands to gain. And we call these the fault lines. And it also zooms in on the sites of struggle, where those in power come face to face with those fighting for a more just future. And these are front lines. And this is kind of the philosophy behind the approach to this book.
Yeah, we have asked several chapter authors to share some cases today, but just to situate their contributions in the greater argument of the book. So the book starts off with an historical account on economic inequalities and looks at various ways elites and institutions of power create and perpetuate inequality. But it also has some very interesting case studies, for example, on digital taxi ride-hailing workers in Nigeria, and how their work has become more precarious against the backdrop of a discourse that actually talks about economic inclusion and a new social contract for gig workers. We also have, case studies about how inequalities are reproduced by bureaucrats through practices in their daily work, mechanisms of intergenerational transmission of inequality. But we also talk beyond vertical or economic wealth inequalities, and we look at horizontal inequalities and the intersections. Often vertical and horizontal inequalities reinforce each other, and we will hear from the colleagues today when they present their cases. And marginalized groups around the world are often also poor groups, those that lack access to jobs, services, resources, and where these inequalities are transferred across generations and across space. The book also explores the more explicit roles that elites play in reproducing inequalities. And for example, an interesting case of how in Mozambique, a process, to actually promote the right to the city was captured by elites, and they shaped it in their interest. The book also zeroes in on elites themselves, on their motives, ideologies, perceptions, and preferences. And we hear a contribution on that. And we also, a number of chapters speak really how, we can use the knowledge about the perceptions and preferences of elites also, to in a way strategize our own engagement with them.
And the final section of the book turns to counterpower, the role of collective action and cross-class mobilization in reigning in elite power and reducing inequalities. So as this 20th century social contract that Kat referred to has unraveled, and previous pathways to mobilizing and accessing right have been closed out. And in general, the extreme nature of inequalities and the power asymmetries that drive them have meant that people have had to adapt their strategies and tools in this new climate. And this climate is really characterized by, in addition to all the inequalities and that we've been talking about, other factors: shifting class structures, the shrinking role of the state, the changing role of work, increased connectivity, but also decreased mobility, advances in technology. So this section is looking at the new forms of social movements, alliances, and coalitions that are emerging in response to this, in ways that marginalized groups are cooperating and collaborating together. One really interesting case covered in the book looks at how domestic work organizations in Uruguay and Paraguay have built networks with new and unexpected types of actors that have shared objectives. So, for example, domestic workers building alliances with housewives in Uruguay. So these two groups together, whose interests from the outside might not seem aligned, are actually rallying around a shared objective of having housework recognized as work and deserving of social protection. So this is just one example of how groups are finding points of commonality to work together. And we'll have more about this topic from Laura Alfers, who's looking at strategies informal workers use to influence social services and how they're provided from below.
Thank you so much. And really, really powerful. I mean, sometimes you read a book and you think that's interesting, I think with this book, people will read it and they will think that is shocking and they want to do something. It moves them to act. Really, really powerful. And also the way in which the book has been produced as a collaboration with some other great authors, really a different way of producing knowledge than the old dead idea of the one individual expert. And really glad that we've got 3 of the chapter authors with us today. We're going to start with Megan. Now, Megan, traditionally, when researchers have been looking at broken societies, they've wanted to spend their time analyzing the very poorest. In your chapter, you spend time trying to get to understand Wall Street money people. Now, for lots of us, that whole world is a mystery. How does their world work? What drives them? Can you help us understand this group at the top?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ben. And it's just such a pleasure and so wonderful to be here today for this book launch. So when I started my research on the hedge fund industry in particular, most of the research on inequality really focused on those who are poor and marginalized by inequality, which is very important, and we need lots of research on that. But it led me to ask kind of this question around what is happening on the other side of this inequality equation? What happens that allows some people to amass so much wealth and money and then wield power because of that? And so that led me to study the hedge fund industry as a case of the 1%. And many of you might not be familiar with what a hedge fund is. So they're small private financial firms that pool large sums of money from wealthy investors and institutions to invest in the stock market. And they generally, especially in the US, where most of them are housed, they have less regulatory oversight than other financial firms, and they pay lower taxes. So this is part of what allows them to kind of amass these riches. And early on in my research, I came across the statistic that 97% of the assets in this $4 trillion industry are managed by firms run entirely by white men. And so that piqued my interest as to how is that tied, this extreme homogeneity of this industry, how is that tied to the money they make and what they can do in the stock market in terms of the risks they take? And so in this chapter, I interviewed 48 hedge fund workers, and I focus on the 17 who had founded a hedge fund. And I wondered, how is it that they can go about founding these lucrative firms? And to become profitable, just to put in perspective, a hedge fund must raise over at least 85 million US dollars. So that is something, they have to have networks that can provide that amount of money. So it is very much an elite endeavor. And the enormous scale allows them to then have these huge payoffs. And one thing that surprised me in my research is that when they do that, one thing they really are motivated to do is that invest in people who they trust or feel kind of connected to. And this is often shaped by perceptions of sameness. So, wealthy investors, wealthy hedge fund managers might hire and then train someone who they think reminds them of themselves. And this is part of kind of a key to why the industry is so extremely white male dominated. And one thing is, and so what I noticed in my research is that these social networks in the industry, whether they were the ones that were hiring or training one another, or that were investing in each other's firms, were very much shaped by gender, race, and social class status and how that organized the social fabric of the industry. And one thing I wanted to call attention to is how this social inequality is one part of the problem, but it's also directly tied to this enormous income inequality that this industry helps to drive and how it allows them to amass so much wealth. And so one thing I just wanted to share a little bit of some snapshots from my findings in this chapter, specifically about how these founders amass so much wealth. And one thing that came up again and again is they cited how you have to start with a friends and family round. So that initial 85 million often comes from their closer networks, their kind of close-knit ties who deem them to be trustworthy to manage their money. And a good example of this was an interview I did with a man who I call Ken, and all the names in my research are pseudonyms. But Ken is a white man from an elite background, which he downplayed, which was very common among my interviewers. And he, many others like him, he kind of downplayed his access to these affluent, rich networks that got his start. And he instead kind of positioned himself as a bootstrapper, somebody who went against the odds and was able to make it big on Wall Street and amass a bunch of riches. But then a little bit of probing in the questions revealed kind of a different story. So if, for example, Ken started his first hedge fund at age 18, and who can do that? And what I found is that only somebody with access to these elite networks. So he had this original friends and family member round that where his father included his father, who was the dean of a business school at that time and ran a hedge fund on the side. His father was friends with a lot of hedge fund people who became some of the biggest hedge fund founders in the world later on. And so they all sort of showed Ken the ropes, so to speak. He got to watch them starting in high school in action, and then some of them invested in him. And so Ken really shows this theme that came up again and again, this downplaying of this elite privilege. And then once you go a little deeper, many of these white men I interviewed came from elite backgrounds. They had access to the training involved. They had access to people who thought they were trustworthy enough to give them lots of money. And so they fundraised in that way. And what I call attention to in this chapter is that, what happens within these networks is it allows a select group to not only amass money for themselves, but then it also allows them to distribute that money. So whether it's investing in the stock market and then the kinds of companies they think are fit, or that they want to succeed, at times it's actually investing in ways that lead to those companies' downfalls. Sometimes they want them to fail and they make money off of it, but they invest in ways that have enormous consequences for workers as a whole. And so when we think about the social inequality in the industry, the fact that it's so elite white male dominated, that's one part of a bigger problem in which, that gets at how the social organization of elite spaces on Wall Street, and I suspect in other contexts like in technology and in government, it allows that people to kind of preserve access and hedge some people in while keeping others out, so that they can maintain this kind of system of less oversight and accountability, where they can call the shots, dictate their own terms with limited repercussions, and even with limited pushbacks to know that they're doing that. So that's so I think what I want to close on is that how it's significant, not just because of who they are, but because what it allows them to do with that money when money is passed along in these ways.
Thank you, Megan. That was amazing. That could be a movie. That story could be a movie. But also, I love how we often say names change to protect the innocent. I think names change to protect the guilty in that one. Graciela, you've been observing elites too. The elites you've been observing are in South Africa and Brazil, and some of those guys in South Africa and Brazil elites, they make the Wall Street guys look soft teddy bears. The inequality in both of those countries is eye-watering. What do the people at the top think? Do they get it? Do they care? What do they want to do about it? Can you paint a picture for us about their understandings, their motivations, and their actions?
Thank you, Ben, for the questions, and thank you, Katja and Maggie, for inviting me to be part of the book and also of this launching event. It's a pleasure to be here also with my co-panelists. As Ben mentioned, we usually think about the Global South elites as the most predatory and insensible to the plight of the poor. And sadly, I'm not here to defend them. I wish I could, but it's also important to understand that how elites in the Global South deal with inequality and poverty can be very different from the way elites in the Global North do, partially because poverty and inequality are in their face. And understanding how these elites see the world allow us to question the assumptions and also the way that they legitimize inequality, partially what Megan just described. At the same time, it's important to remember that elites are not homogeneous, especially when we go beyond the definition that it's purely based on economics. And I think for us, the case of Brazil and South Africa are very interesting. There are cases that countries that transitioned to democracy in the 1990s and brought to power governments that were committed with distribution. Therefore, social and redistributive policies have been in the political agenda of these two countries, at least for the past 30 years. And here in Brazil, we just had the presidential debate yesterday. And it's clear that poverty was mentioned by nearly all the candidates as a key problem, and also wealth concentration. So there is a lot on stake. And I think those issues, the fact that those issues are on stake, make elites have to react to it, maybe in a different way. But back to the chapter, which I should mention I co-authored with Matthias Lopes, Hannah Tiger, and Elisa Hayes. And we have been working on this as part of a larger project. So the idea of the chapter and of this larger project is to understand how elites perceive on inequality and what they understand as the possible solutions to it. Do they, in the case they find it a problem, understand what types of solutions they would support? In order to do that, what we have done is to conduct surveys with economic, civil servants, and political elites in Brazil and South Africa. So the first question been asked, do elites see inequality? The short answer is yes, they do, and they do see it as a problem. How much they care about this as a problem, it's a bit more ambiguous. We found that elites, for example, in South Africa, believe that in moderate levels, inequality can be beneficial to economy. But at the same time, nearly all the elites saw negative consequences of poverty and inequality, and interestingly, not only to the poor, but also to themselves. In both countries, for example, urban violence was pointed out as a consequence of inequality that really made them not be able to profit their wealth or their cities. And I think more recently, we also saw with COVID that informal labor markets and precarious and crowded housing were perceived as increasing the risks of COVID in those countries. When it comes to understand what they want to do about it, it's important to take into account not only what they want, but also what they think is doable and viable, and why do they think that way. So most elites in these countries, when asked, agree that redistribution policies are necessary and do find many social policies desirable. But they are much less convinced that many of these policies are viable. And this is in part because they do not trust the state to implement them. And here, discourses of corruption or lack of competence really appear very salient in both countries. But sometimes it's also because they do not trust the population of their countries and commonly label the poor as ignorant, lazy, or irrational, very sort of classical, undeserving, poor types of narratives. I think a very interesting example to look more carefully, and I will conclude on that, is cash transfers, probably because they are the most visible policies of the global South in the last decades. And many elites surveyed in Brazil and South Africa do think and see the benefits of these policies and are willing to keep it as it is or even expand it. But they also fear the possible negative consequences of these policies. In the case of Brazil, for example, the idea of political patronage brought by these policies is very strong. While in the case of South Africa, narratives of dependency or making people lazy or even encouraging people to have more children are also very salient. Again, showing how much social policies themselves can are delegitimized by these negative perceptions about the population. But it's interesting also that, especially when you look in Brazil, there is the possibility that these policies could change the way people think about social policies. For example, the traditional idea that economic growth is the only way to decline or to decrease poverty is inverted in Brazil. A lot of the people we interview do believe that cash transfer, for example, can help economic growth and not the way around. And that was a big predictor of them supporting or not cash transfers. In the chapter, I discuss some of this and other findings in detail, but I will stop here to keep you curious for the Q&A and, of course, to read the book. And thank you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Graciela, for shining a light on those at the top in South Africa and Brazil. Now, our final panelist is Laura. Now, Laura, you're a brilliant researcher, but you're also, I want to say, and you're also an activist organizer. And for you, those two ways of engaging in this issue of inequality strengthen each other. You don't see a separateness between those two. And your chapter, you share stories of how informal workers are developing ways to respond to and challenge inequalities. So much on inequality is a story of things getting worse, but your work offers a route to progress. So can you share with us some of what's most promising and exciting in the approaches which groups of informal workers are pursuing?
Thanks, Ben. And I think, I mean, to me, what is most important and exciting about the chapter is probably has already been mentioned, is that we're highlighting the work of two quite strong organizations of workers in the informal economy. One in India, the Self-Employed Women's Association, and HomeNet Thailand in India. Really showing that workers, even those at the bottom of the pyramid, can get organized, and as a result of that organization are able to develop power. And it can be, and then are able to use that power in strategic ways to promote change. And in this case, we have an example of worker organizations sort of pushing for more participatory and functional frontline health services in the two countries. And I think it is a fundamental point about collective action and organization that is important when we talk about inequality. No single worker at the bottom of the pyramid would have been able to make these types of changes described in the chapter without the power of organization, the power that organization gives to people, not just workers, but in this case, I am looking at workers in the informal economy. And so I just wanted to underscore that as probably one of the sort of fundamental issues of that comes out of the chapter. I think secondly, what I found inspiring and interesting about these examples is that in both cases, both organizations are focused on very practical actions to support their members to access better and more participatory healthcare, but at the same time are turning those very practical actions into strategic political actions to transform the nature of the state from the bottom up. And I think this feeds into quite a big debate. I mean, we have, for example, the Self-Employed Women's Association, 2 million members. They have their own health cooperative. It runs its own health insurance scheme. It has its own cadres of community health workers who do preventive health work and so on for the members. But it often comes under quite a lot of criticism for doing that. You know, you're letting the state off the hook, you're undermining state provision and so on and so forth. But I ask in this chapter, are they really doing that? Because at the same time as providing all of those services, they are using that provision to empower members, and particularly their community health workers who are drawn up from their membership, to engage in policy advocacy right from the bottom of the state all the way to the top. And with an intent to transform the way in which the state works, to transform the way in which these kind of to transform the sort of reproduction of inequality through the institutions of the state. So, I mean, one of the great examples was talking to a Sewa community health worker who had been through an empowerment process with Sewa. And she was now going to go and talk to a frontline health official for the first time in her life to advocate for better health service. And she said, I cried. I have never talked to a person from the government before in my life. You know, this is absolutely terrifying to me. Now it's normal for me, but before that, I could not communicate with the state. So that kind of, really shining a light on that kind of empowerment and how important it is to focus on that empowerment, which allows everyday people to develop a relationship with the government, so that those frontline institutions are not just reproducing local inequalities. I mean, part of the thing as well is then getting members elected onto local health committees who are then able to define the priorities of how local health funds are spent. And this is a similar process to what we saw in Thailand, with HomeNet Thailand really coaching its members to be able to access local health funds and to define the way in which those funds are spent in a much more bottom-up manner than had been done before. And really also teaching them about the networking skills that many elites come naturally to many elites and their building of relationships with governments and with those who hold power. Many people at the bottom, at the grassroots, don't necessarily have those skills, but they're really, through these organizations are learning to use those strategic network building and social skills that allow them to access resources and again, sort of enter these bureaucratic spaces where they can then potentially disrupt sort of the unfair ways in which money is being spent or inequalities are being reproduced. And so I think both of these examples are really good examples of what it can mean to democratize public provision. How do we get to a situation where people start to have a real voice in the way public services are run? And I think both of these examples point one way. It's not the only way. And I think that's important about the types of power that grassroots organizations can use. There are different types of power. This is one way in which organizations are using power through strategically sort of developing relationships with the state. There are many other forms, but I think it points one way towards that. And I think it's important because until people start feeling like they have a real ownership over the public sphere, over their own public sphere, I'm not sure we will ever have the groundswell of public support that's needed to protect it. And without protecting it, inequality inevitably worsens. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Laura. And it was so powerful how you touched on the emotional and the psychological aspects of power both as a through organizing, but also power through consciousness raising and through feeling confident to challenge. We're now going to open up to questions. So please, everybody, do use the Q&A function. You can also tweet using the hashtag between fault lines. And to kick us off, I'm going to ask Maggie and Katja a question. So here we are at the United Nations, and your book is challenging the power elites and urging a radical shift. Are we going to get into trouble? And what kind of reaction and pushback have you gotten for this work?
Thanks, Ben. That's a really interesting question. And thinking about it, I have to say, actually, we didn't get a lot of pushback. And I was thinking about that. Is that a good or a bad thing? I think maybe the place we hold within the UN system, gives us a little bit that leeway, that freedom to raise some contentious issues and shift the debates and, make inputs into the global narratives without immediately being perceived as a threatening player. I think actually the feedback we got was very positive. It was astonishingly positive, because it didn't just came from like-minded academics, the NGO community, the civil society community, which immediately joined forces with us, came to the conference, really appreciated the space that was opening up. But also we got a lot of good feedback, from other UN agencies, from colleagues in other institutions. And that is quite across the board, because I think there is a rising awareness, of the fact that, the poverty focus needs to be complemented by looking at the entire income distribution. That is increasingly even an argument, for the international financial organizations. We want to look at the entire income distribution, and we want to look at, the top 1% and the bottom 40. I think what is maybe a little bit more contentious, generally speaking, is, saying, why is there not political will? What are the political drivers, the obstacles to transformative change? Most agencies debate concrete actions, policy recommendations. Everyone knows, how we can reduce inequalities. So we are asking that hard question. So why isn't it happening then? Who is maybe working against it? And not a lot of the UN partners can take up these questions. But what I'm seeing is openly, because they don't have a mandate for it, it's not their task in a way to criticize member states or to put, big companies on the spot. However, I see that even at the highest leadership of the UN, the language is changing. And there is more focus, on what are those doing that have really power and resources? How can we bring them back into the social contract? How can we build alliances, from the very rich to the very poor? So yes, I think, mostly positive feedback, maybe a question mark, of when it really gets to changes on the ground, what is happening. So there's maybe a lot of support in terms of the discourse, the narrative, but we are obviously more ambitious than that. We want to see changes on the ground. So that's another question.
Super, super. Okay. I have a question to Megan. Megan, what are the policy implications of your findings? Paul asks, what can be done to address gender inequality in finance and tech?
Thank you for these questions, Paul. And I think this is a great, or is an important kind of puzzle with this research. So one thing setting out on this research, I really wanted to understand hedge funds in light of rising income and economic inequality and how social inequality was tied to that. But then as I would do interviews with women in particular, they kept saying, I don't really have any room to complain because I get paid well enough that the things I have to deal with in this industry are worth putting up with. And I'd hear this again from a number of people. And it became more and more alarming to me, especially when I realized how kind of rampant sexual harassment is in the industry. And so it led me to kind of change the takeaways that I came away from the research with. And one is that, I think that everybody deserves to have a workplace setting where they feel respected and empowered, and that they have equal access to opportunities. And I don't want to I want to be careful too, because I think, and I think that changing these kind of elite workplaces can have ramifications or set standards in other settings. And I want to be careful in stating that because often, workers in different contexts need different solutions for the problem of inequality in the workplace. So it's not to say that it would be a one size fits all, but it was disconcerting to me to hear this kind of sense of not having ground to make change. And so I think that also points to where policy change is so necessary. And I think in general, one of the things is when I think about the role of the industry in economic inequality, I think of it as tied to this lack of oversight issue and the fact that they can kind of call their own terms in so many ways. And that's tied to finding the gender and racial inequality in the industry. So doing a number of policy measures to curb that sense of kind of empowerment and blazon empowerment in the industry, whether it's to raise income taxes so that they're more akin to income taxes. Right now, they're taxed as capital gains taxes in the US, which are lower, or whether it's to increase regulatory oversight. I think these kind of measures would help to curb that extreme privilege that the industry holds, and then help to also curb what happens within it and kind of break up that boys club mentality. I also want to point out the role of institutions in making a difference. So one of the common misconceptions of the industry is that it's entirely funded by elites, that it's all wealthy money, but actually the majority of its income or its assets that it invests come from large institutions. So those are pension funds that represent the workers who their investments often disenfranchise those very workers whose pensions are invested in them. So thinking about that kind of those institutional relationships and what institutions could put pressure on them to change their practices in a number of ways to make the industry more equitable and accountable to the people it serves. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We have a question from Madhavan, which I think is for Maggie. And it's are we talking about a social economy? Is this what we need? Have we lost the social aspect of economy? And is that the kind of framework that will take us to where we need to be?
Thanks, Madhavan, for that question. And it's interesting, it sort of feeds into our sort of the culmination of this project on inequalities that we've been working on for a long time, which is the publication of our flagship report, which is on inequalities in crisis. And in fact, our report builds to sort of an idea, a model for a new way forward, which we frame around the idea of a new eco-social contract. So replacing these broken social contracts with ones that work towards sustainable environmental sustainability, social and economic justice, and that are rooted in things like building new alternative economic systems into into our daily interactions, shifting and reimagining multilateral spaces, because as we've been talking about already a little bit, the UN itself is a space that's incredibly unequal in terms of the outsized role of the private sector in multilateral policymaking. And also, and sort of the crux of this is moving towards transformative social policies that address the root causative of problems rather than the symptoms. And certainly, a social and solidarity-based economy is a key aspect of this sort of platform for a new a re-envisioned future that is more just and equitable and sustainable. And I really encourage you to read more in the flagship report that's coming out in a few weeks, and follow along a bit the research we have on that as well.
Thank you. I've got one, I think, for Katja, which is from David. David asks about the role of philanthropy of the 1%. But I think he's asking in a critical way about whether this is shaping too much policy in terms of philanthropic capitalism. Do you look at that, and what's your response to that question of the challenge of the influence through philanthropy?
Yeah, thank you very much, David, for that question. Actually, it gives me the opportunity to say that in addition to this book we are launching today, we have an occasional paper series that also came out of this 2018 conference, and where actually one of the papers focuses on philanthropy in the UK. And in the context of this flagship report we are publishing very soon and very excited about as well, we also have a piece on climate philanthropy. So it's actually, it is on our radar. And what we found out, interestingly, is that philanthropy, you can look at it through a lens of elite reproduction. So very often it functions actually as a way, where elite groups and families reproduce certain privileges, through foundations, through their philanthropic work, and also get their children in a way, often engaged in philanthropic work, but which then, gets them into the family business to a certain extent. And in terms of climate philanthropy, what we have seen is that it can open spaces, it can help a lot of organizations, to get seed funding. They're doing a lot of good work. On the other hand, again, and this is something that applies to philanthropy in general, it legitimizes, a system where basically, those at the top and the big capital owners basically dispose of their wealth, decide what to do, decide where to invest, and that can often be to the detriment, of public strategies. As Megan said, it is a little bit this lack of accountability, and it's a tax-saving mechanism. So sometimes it legitimizes also certain, solutions that they feel, are beneficial in terms of, for example, climate action. So I think, there is a good part with philanthropy, definitely, but that shouldn't prevent us, to scrutinize these things and to question, in a way, the function that it plays in the broader system and how that reproduces inequalities in the region.
Thank you. I've got one for Graciela. This is from Willie. Willie asks, people in power have the power to stay in power. So that kind of elite wealth power loop. How to break that loop? Graciela, your thoughts?
Well, that's a hard one, especially in the middle of Brazilian elections. I think we're struggling with this. But I do think that debates, right? And really, I think one of the goals in studying elites' narratives and perceptions is actually to question the assumptions through which elites see the world. And I think that's the best way that we can do to sort of break this thing, that the way that they are describing reality is what reality is. So in that sense, what I see more and more, it's a dispute of narratives. And I think the fact of the book And when you look at debates around inequality, the fact that it's gaining more and more space in the debate, which is something that when I started working with this 10, 15 years ago, it was really not in the agenda. So I do think that to change the types of elites who are in power, it's really to show that political elites don't have to be the same as economic elites, and really paying attention to the tensions that exist between those two groups. It's essential to break the pure reproduction of elites, but it's very hard. And I think to build on the previous question on philanthropy, what we see often is the opposite, right? Because now, I mean, it sometimes can appear as cruel to say that elites who are doing big philanthropic projects are doing a wrong thing. And I don't want to go as far as that, but I think it's worrisome when you see certain foundations having more power than the nation states, because those foundations were not elected by anyone. And now they get to decide a lot, while people who have a vote and their votes are basically not counting. So the fact that elites have economic power, and through this economic power, instead of paying taxes, they decided that they want to create their foundations. And through those foundations, they are deciding which policies are going to be moved forward. It's really anti-democratic in a very essential way. So I think that's one, just to build on the previous question, I think that that's one of the main it's important to go back to this idea of nation states, policies, and taxes that can be very boring and sound sometimes old school, but that's the only way that we can actually, through voting and through collective participation and social movements, change and question, in a way, elite powers.
Thank you.
I wish I had a better answer.
No, it's a great one. And then Laura, Jacqueline asks, if economic elites have captured the state, then what can civil society do to reverse that?
Thanks. So I feel about similar to Graciela, and that's a huge, a huge question. I mean, I really liked Graciela's point about surfacing the narratives and assumptions which underpin and sort of create the hegemony that allows those economic elites to have so much power, to allow there to be this consensus that we need them. And I think that, yeah, exposing those assumptions, but then also perhaps developing an alternative knowledge base that allows us to say, well, actually, that assumption is just wrong. For example, regulating the labor market is going to lead to unemployment and informality. It may be one assumption. So now we have to deregulate our labor markets. It might be that actually what we need to do is build up an alternative knowledge base that allows a wide portion of society to be able to say, actually, that's not true. And this kind of stuff can help to change narratives and to change mindsets and to create different ideas about what's needed. It can be a power in and of itself. And I think perhaps civil society organizations could work with researchers and academics to develop these strong counter narratives based on alternative evidence that is needed to counteract the kind of ideas that economic elites put out and say, well, this is just the way it has to be. Otherwise, the country is going to collapse. Otherwise, the economy is going to collapse. Very often in South Africa, that is the narrative we get. If we don't deregulate the labor market, we're never going to be able to sort out this economic inequality problem. But is that really the way? So I think coming at it from the top, as in questioning those assumptions, surfacing them, and then producing alternative narratives and alternative evidence is important. But at the same time, I mean, I think it's important for civil society to get organized as well. If we're in a context where economic elites have captured the state, just one or two civil society groups going it alone to challenge this is probably not going to be as effective as bringing together a wide coalition of civil society groups and saying, okay, this is the issue that we're going to tackle, and this is how we're doing it. And not to forget that can look different at multiple levels of the state. It can look different if we are challenging grassroots frontline health inequalities to sitting in the National Bargaining Council and challenging things there. But at every level of the state, that's where things need to be challenged. They're all important, and there should be a move perhaps to support civil society, becoming a part of the state in a way, engaging with the state in those ways that I described in the chapter is also one way to think about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. So we're coming to our time. I first want to invite people to an event that's taking place on the 21st of October here in Geneva at 4 o'clock on the 21st of October. And that's the launch of the UNRISD flagship report, Crises of Inequality. And it's a really great follow-on and builds to this conversation. So please do join that. And the ways to join that are shared in the chat, but they're also shared online on Twitter. So please do come to that. Do get hold of a copy of this book. As I was sharing, there's a discount code in the chat and also online on Twitter. And please keep sharing your thoughts on this conversation, everybody, on Twitter, hashtag between fault lines. Now, we have time for one final question, which I'm asking of all of the panelists. We've talked about some very bleak and tough things. We've talked about a cyclicality to wealth and power. And that can make us, that can expose and make us feel aware, but there's also a danger that it makes us feel despair. So help out our audience, give them reasons. What gives you hope that inequality need not be our forever fate? And what's your advice to audience members who want to make a difference? So what gives you hope? And what's your advice to our audience members who want to make a difference? I'm going to start with Megan.
Thank you. I think what gives me hope is thinking about, again, going back to these fault lines, these kind of cracks in the system that emerge that could allow for change. And I think the pandemic has been that in a big way. And I think, as Katja mentioned, it's made the wealthy, the top wealth holders, amass ever greater wealth, but it's also become a time where there have been all kinds of counter movements emerge. So in the US, we've seen, inroads in terms of the fight for 15, people mobilizing to form labor unions at companies that previously have not had them and have been able to completely disempower and prevent labor unions. And I think that, these seem disconnected from hedge funds, but at the same time, the people I study invest in ways that help to kind of marginalize those very workers. And so looking at these sites of resistance, these moments of pushback is really, to me, a moment of hope of how this kind of power can be curbed. And I think my takeaway for, I guess, the audience is just one thing I always stress, it's one thing I get a lot of questions from, especially like graduate students thinking about what to study or people thinking about where to work. There's often this assumption that elite populations are incredibly closed off and hard to access. And while that's true on an institutional scale, on a one-on-one scale, it is possible to kind of break in, get to understand this world. And so I just always, I want to encourage people who are thinking about new topics to study or projects to take on in applied work, to not feel like you can't approach these groups because they are just, they are people and they're, eager to share their stories. They're often open to challenging conversations they're often thinking these things themselves. A lot of the people I interviewed are former academics who went into finance. So they often think about these kind of issues and want to talk about them further. So that would be my big takeaway, is think about what group you might have access to or to study or to push for an applied change where it could make an impact.
Thank you so much, Megan. Graziella, what gives you hope and what's your advice to our audience who want to make a difference?
Thank you. I think what gives me hope, it's for so long, we always thought about poor and poverty as social problems, and now we are thinking about wealth and elites as social problems. And I think this is really a big change in the way to see things and allow us to change the focus and really put responsibility on people who actually have power. And exactly, I think, going back to a point that Katja mentioned, making the clear link between power and inequality and how they are related, and how political inequality and socioeconomic inequality are clearly related, and putting back democracy on the table as an important topic, because I think for a while we took democracy for granted. And now again, we are going back and thinking that democracy is not only vote, but it's also about social democracy, and it's also about really giving the possibility of people to have a voice, which is something that I think was out of the table for a while. So I think there is hope. I have to be hopeful because I have elections in Brazil on Sunday. So, but I do think that there are certain topics that are on the table, and we just need to bring different voices and fight for more people to have voice and rights.
Thank you so much, Graciela. Laura, what gives you hope, and what's your guidance to audience members that are keen to make a difference?
Thanks, Ben. I mean, I as you mentioned, I have one foot in the academic world and one foot in the world of sort of working for an organization that brings together organizations, grassroots organizations of informal workers around the world. And sometimes when I'm sitting in my academic job behind my laptop, sitting in South Africa, I think we're the most unequal country in the world at the moment. We regularly fight that out with Brazil. I do lose hope about how anything is ever going to change. But I must say what gives me hope is the way that when I go out into the world again and start working with the organizations of workers in the informal economy, and these are often the people bearing the absolute brunt of the policy choices which exacerbate inequality, and see the way that they keep working, the way that they keep organizing, keep strategizing, keep being creative, keep pushing to make things better, even at the worst of times during COVID. Those organizations continued supporting, advocating for change, thinking through how they were going to, work on things in the future, making a real difference in people's lives. And I take inspiration from that, and I think we should all take inspiration from that. If these people who are the ones who bear the brunt of inequality are not giving up, neither can or neither should we. That should be a call to us to continue doing exactly the same: strategize, think, organize. And I think that last point is probably my call to action. Support organization, become involved in organizations, working to establish the counter narrative against inequality, and even making that a reality. The only way we're going to change things is if there is an organized strategy against the forces deepening inequality. And so I think that call to organize is probably how I would suggest people become involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maggie, what gives you hope, and what's your advice for audience members who want to make a difference?
Well, I think that this book and the work of these authors and the other authors in the book is evidence of a shift that's happening, where people are looking at powers in ways we haven't before and actually naming it. And I think that's such a powerful act that's happening in all different kinds of spaces, whether they're academic, political debates, calls to action. Any space that can be carved out and co-opted as one of resistance. And I mean, like, here we are, as you said, in the Palais, having these conversations in spaces where these power dynamics are very strongly felt, and we haven't been kicked out yet. I'm still here. And I think that this is symbolic, but it's also strategic. I mean, you can make a difference within systems, not only on the outside of them, and make those debates reverberate loudly. And so this role, at UNRIS, where we're providing a platform for research and voices and sharing that knowledge with a wider audience, but it's also for others about mobilizing networks and pushing back elites' power within their own communities and reclaiming power in their own daily lives. So I think my advice would be to sort of locate your space where you feel empowered to act and use tools and strategies that aren't pulled from necessarily some formula, but from your own personal experience and knowledge traditions. But also the importance, I think, we see from a lot of the cases, especially in the last section of the book, about finding points of commonality with others who might seem disconnected from your project, but in fact are working towards the same goals. And so it's about identifying those goals.
Thank you. Katja, what gives you hope? What's your advice to audience members that want to make a difference?
Yeah, actually, I think there are a lot of reasons, good reasons for hope. And I think, I mean, speaking from the UN, I think SDG 10 gives me hope. It was a big struggle to get it onto the agenda. It was the joint fight of, academics, UN people, major groups, civil society, and it's a big achievement. And I see also the way that this SDG is evolving is encouraging. The way that slowly, actors refer not only to the bottom 40%, but also to extreme inequality is encouraging. The way inequality becomes mainstream now in development cooperation. We just finished a training course yesterday with a development cooperation agency where actually political drivers of inequalities was one session topic, and people are interested in it. So this is all very promising. And of course it needs, a constant engagement, to make it happen. As I said, one thing is to have an agenda. The other thing is to implement it and really make it happen. I think another thing that gives me hope is what Laura talked about. Just, this collective organization that is happening, all the social movements that are now, mobilizing around justice issues, economic justice issues, inequalities, the responsibilities of the rich, of companies, of the state, claiming rights, but also saying, we want to bring ourselves in. When we use that concept of an eco-social contract, we want to also communicate that idea that everyone has something to contribute, but everyone has also an obligation. So there are rights and obligations, and people are taking on board a lot of obligations. Most people are really complying with a lot of roles, and they have legitimate claims and rights, and they have to hold, those that have to deliver to account. So it's very important, to really trust and participate and empower all these movements. And finally, I think the advice, for those who want to make a difference on inequalities, I think, again, speaking from a research background, get informed, get robust arguments to make your case, use the evidence, and also, that the plurality of evidence and models that are available to make your case. There is not just one economic doctrine that explains it all. As Laura said, a lot of the assumptions, are wrong. They are overtaken by reality. We have a strong case to make on what works and what doesn't work. So I think, that power of collective action is very important, and having the right arguments, to speak to those in power.
Thank you. Please do join that conversation on the 21st of October on the crisis of inequality. And you can find details in the chat, but you can also find details online. If you didn't get a chance to have your question answered, then please tweet it using the hashtag between fault lines, and Maggie and Katja and our other authors will try to answer your question on Twitter if you didn't get to ask it here. There's some wonderful, inspiring comments in the chat here. Colleagues sharing from that they hear from all around the world, from Iran to the Philippines. Just some lovely. One person's just written "so good," and another has written a note to the authors to say, "Keep rocking it. Proud of you." So someone saying, I've learned so much from all of the presenters, and how inspired people feel after today. So that's incredible, exceptional feedback. Do get hold of a copy of the book. Do take advantage of the discount. Bobby Kennedy, when he was reflecting on two great classical thinkers, he said that when Cicero spoke, people said, wow, what a great speech. But when Demosthenes spoke, people said, let's march. This is the kind of book that doesn't just make you say, what a great book, it makes you say, let's march. And what gives me hope are the 5 brilliant authors that we've had speaking today, and the 100 participants who joined in this conversation. So please get hold of the book, arm yourself non-violently with wisdom and courage and friends, and join again on the 21st. Thank you so much for everybody for joining this conversation, and look forward to being part of the conversation with you again on the 21st.